America is being exposed as the single most corrupt nation on the planet. I think we even beat the Ukrainians in scope and scale of our corruption. And the leaders of this corruption is the Democratic Party. Because while the Republicans aren't perfect, and while the Republicans don't have the best policies, I personally like a lot of the policies that the Democrats put out. I believe in clean air. I believe in education. I want all this stuff to happen. But what happens is they use my belief, my desire for clean air, to create an environmental protection agency that becomes a cow of corruption. It doesn't accomplish anything. It becomes a permanent bureaucratic edifice that takes billions of dollars and disseminates it to people who don't produce anything of value, just enrichment. This is how America has been operating, the corruption of this. So what Trump has done is to declare war on this, to dismantle this. Are you beginning to understand why the loudest voices screaming in opposition to what Donald Trump is doing are Democratic voices? Because Donald Trump is destroying their gravy train, their thread of corruption, that which empowered them, disguised as official spending by the U.S. government, therefore never to be questioned, but never to be audited, never to be stopped, just a permanent flow of money. Ask yourself why we can never cut a budget. Because once we begin the gravy train, you can't end the gravy train. There are checks going out to programs that have been around for 30 years and nobody asks what they're doing, why they're doing. The checks just keep flowing and the checks keep getting cashed, which means somebody on the receiving end is putting that money in their pocket. For what? To change the world for the better? No, it's corruption. This is what's being destroyed. And this is why the Democrats are screaming the loudest. This isn't about preserving American honor and American dignity. This isn't about protecting the world or feeding the homeless or helping the. It's about keeping the money flowing to their wives' secret bank account, whatever. The Democratic Party is fundamentally flawed. The most corrupt, fundamentally corrupt people in the world, arrest them, put them on trial. We don't have the death penalty, but put them in jail for the rest of their pathetically short lives. And so Trump is saying it all has to go. We're going to tear it all down. And when it comes to Ukraine, look at what he's tearing down. NATO. Mark my words. We're not going to be in NATO much longer. We may not be in NATO by the end of summer. And when that goes, if you want to think about programs that do nothing except serve as employment vehicles of people who do nothing for political purposes, NATO, the NATO bureaucracy is this: think tank after think tank, working group, advisory committee. Hundreds of thousands of people are employed who do nothing, zero. And it's all paid for by the American taxpayer. And the Democrats benefit from it because they stack all these things. All these people that normally couldn't get a job anywhere get these highly funded sinecures at think tanks to sit down and just spew propaganda. And they get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this by the American taxpayer. And if Trump takes it to the next level, which he could, because he has a attorney general and a director of the FBI that are not of the system, they should all be arrested. We should be talking about the fundamental purpose. First of all, the entire construct of American foreign aid is corrupt because it's not about helping anybody. It's about empowering America by using foreign aid as a cover to achieve regime change or regime manipulation. There's a reason why Donald Trump fired all of the inspectors generals, because the inspectors generals come from the ranks of the already corrupted, people who have already sold out to the system, and they rise up. They're supposed to police something, but they're not. They're the gatekeepers to ensure that no fundamental change takes place. It's not about policing, it's about preventing change from happening. And when you take a look at, again, this is just a straight up statement of fact. As DOGE, and your audience is familiar with DOGE, I hope, the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a department, it's just this made up construct. But it had to be made up, just so people understand. You cannot deconstruct an evil empire by relying on the minions of the empire to deconstruct it. The Republic of Georgia was the recipient of hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. money, foreign aid money. Last year, I did a deep dig into it. I broke apart the USAID budget. And what I found, what we were doing in Georgia was promoting alternative cultural concepts in the name of diversity. But instead of respecting that reality, what we sought to do was alter that reality by coming in. And the very first thing we do is we empower diversity. Now, that may work here in America. Some would say it hasn't worked, hence what's happening today. That's an American concept, an American construct. That's how America deals with America problems. Now we're taking this American solution to a problem and applying it to Georgia, empowering elements of their society that their society would normally not empower. Georgia's a fundamentally conservative nation. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying it's Georgia. That is the reality. And what Doge is finding out is that throughout the entire construct of foreign policy, we're looking at 95, 96, 98% of the money is going to democratic, politically driven programs. So first thing you do is you shatter the cultural identity of the targeted nation. And then you come in and you empower them politically. The next layer is the creation of grassroots political movements around this new diverse identity, and they're empowered politically. And then you promote political change from the grassroots up. Anytime you hear the United States speak of grassroots political movements, you know what I'm talking about. It's about a revolution from below. Now, you still have the problem with the Georgian government at the top of the pyramid. So how do you deal with that problem? The third layer they put in there is about information. But why aren't you paying for it? Why does America have to come in and impose this on you? And I just told you why. Because we're trying to do to you what we tried to do to Georgia, what we try to do to everywhere. We have to have a good press, a solid press, a sound press. And so you promote a free press, but all you're doing is layer in a layer of propaganda that then the final step, or I guess the penultimate step, is fighting disinformation. So you build your propaganda machine, and now anybody who criticizes what you do is immediately attacked as disinformation, misinformation, Russian, this, so you silence the opposition, and then you have your final election where you tell the government they have no choice to go because the people have decided that they are in charge. That's the model of USAID. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. Fortunately, Georgia Dream was smart enough to identify this and come up with the alternatives. The point is that this model that we have, it's one of these. Now you got me thinking economically. You should have done that. It's like a Ponzi scheme. You know what I'm saying? A Ponzi scheme can never work because you're basically robbing everybody to enrich the person at the top under the flawed theory that they're going to make it to the top. And I think Donald Trump, because he's not on the set, one of the problems we have is we keep electing presidents that come from the establishment. And so they come from a system that is addicted to the economic power that is derived by the sick relationship between American militarism and American economic strength. And so they're blinded to the fact that they're literally driving off a cliff. When you have, and maybe this is what military Keynesianism is all about, a giant Ponzi scheme. When you have an American industrial base that in order to thrive requires conflict. The problem is each growth cycle requires more conflict and more conflict until we get to the top where the ultimate conflict is nuclear conflict and we all die. We finally got a guy who didn't come from those roots and he got in there and he went, hey, we're getting ready to drive off a cliff. Why don't we stop the car? Now, everybody can say, but America's been heading to that cliff forever now. You say, yeah, but I'm the driver now. I want to stop the car. What I don't understand is why the world doesn't go, please stop the car. Instead, they're going, no, when Obama has a seat, he accelerated. I'm going to blame you for everything Obama did. Okay, but I want to stop the car. Let Trump stop the car. And that's what he's trying to do is stop this Ponzi scheme, this existential Ponzi scheme from turning into a nuclear conflict. But to do that, you have to deconstruct how America interfaces with the world. But the whole concept of that was creating an alternative social economic construct. It didn't play out, but I think you could say that BRICS is a modern day manifestation of that Bandung philosophy. And so what BRICS is Eurasia, the Pacific, the global South, saying we want to not become trapped into this paradigm of militarized, conflict that feeds the American hegemon. India, Pakistan, that's a problem. India, China, that's a problem. India America is going to become a problem. There's no doubt about that. But at least when we, for the most part, nations that are outside of the transatlantic bubble are seeking to resolve conflicts diplomatically and economically. The European Union, NATO, Ukraine actively conspired with the Biden administration in the lead up to the 2024 election in November to put their thumb on the scale of the election to get the American people to vote against Donald Trump. Zelensky was the political enemy of Trump. J.D. Vance brought this up in the meeting. And I have to say, the fact that J.D. Vance spoke and the words that he spoke was not a spontaneous moment. This was a rehearsed moment. He was like in the WWF tag team wrestling. He was waiting and Donald Trump went, tag, you're in, boom, came in, bam, down goes Zelensky. This was pre-planned because Zelensky is the enemy. He's the enemy of peace. Europe is the enemy. NATO is the enemy. Trump knows all of this. And what we saw in the White House was the culminating moments of political maneuver warfare that was taking place, that started in NATO, started in Munich, and finished with Zelensky sitting in the White House getting the knockout blow delivered. Zelensky will not recover from this. I think today there's going to be a meeting where some strategic decisions are made. Europe right now, and they went through the motions of rallying around Zelensky, but the reality is setting in. He is the problem. And they're saying that you must go back and you must beg forgiveness from the White House. They're in the business of winning. And by crushing the European Union and crushing NATO, all resistance, all these are the people that conspired together after Trump won the election to Trump-proof American policy. I'll say it again, to Trump-proof American policy. He is going to be the president, and these people conspired to come up with policies designed to shackle him, prevent him from doing his job as the commander-in-chief. Now, you have to be careful how you go about doing this, but this was ever since Steve Witkoff came back from Moscow, where he had a remarkable meeting on February 11th and 12th with Vladimir Putin and a guy named Kirill Dmitriev, the economist behind the Russian economic revival and the man who has put James Carville's words, it's the economy stupid, and brought him back into political relevance here in the United States, where the focus is on the economy, not on military solutions. Trump had this phone call with Putin, and that phone call changed everything, because that phone call injected reality into this discussion. And then Pete Hegseth went off to NATO and J.D. Vance went off to Munich, and their job was to be disruptive. And they did it. They threw little grenades into these rooms and got Europe in a panic, spinning amongst itself. That's what you do, because this is political maneuver warfare, the OODA loop writ large. Your job is to get them to react to you and continue that cycle of action, reaction, until you shoot them down and then destroy them. Do you think Donald Trump forgets this or will forgive this? No. Donald Trump is in the midst of a revolution, a domestic revolution that we've seen manifested in the takedown of USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and others, and a foreign policy revolution where he's redefining our relationships, where we will no longer be held captive by entities such as the European Union and NATO that openly conspire against the sitting president of the United States of America. That is intolerable, and it won't be tolerated going forward. I think you're going to see that the next century is going to be defined by the new big four, and that is the United States, Russia, China, and India sitting down and telling Europe, you're not invited to this. Go make your bed and breakfast, because that's what Europe's going to become, a glorified bed and breakfast where people can go and visit and listen to quaint accents. But that's it. Europe's not a power. It's nothing. It'll be done. That's cool. It's not perfect. I can't guarantee that everything's going to come up smelling like roses. What's the best thing about it? In the United States is changing its outlook, where the lead foot that we take isn't the military foot, it's the economic foot. And as soon as you start talking about the economy, you know what you do? You humanize this. War is about killing. Hopefully can train the next generation of people who lead economically, which means when I sit down with you, I'm asking you how to put food into the bellies of my family, and you're asking me how to put food into the bellies of your family. And now we agree on something. We're not trying to kill each other. We're trying to nurture each other. We're trying to make life livable. The big four are going to be governing, and that's the transition that's taking place here. And we're going to go off and deal with real people. And this is the genius of Trump, because when we sit down with people, it's not the relation between master and servant, equals. When we sit down with Modi, it's not the relationship between craftsman and tool, equals. When we sit down with China, we still have to fix this Chinese relationship, but we will. It'll be as equals. We need to tell the military, you don't get to call the shots. If we choose to have a military, it's going to be a military that is sized appropriately, because the way we interface with the world today is through diplomats and businessmen. We don't send the generals out to represent us anymore. And I also think that the big four are going to redefine the global relationships. Why? The United Nations was a product of war, and the United Nations is a construct of war. The Security Council is the lead element in the United Nations. If the United Nations was reflective of the genuine requirements of humanity, we would lead with the social, economic, and food aspect of it. They would be the number one players. The Security Council would be this minor little adjunct, but instead we lead with the Security Council, which talks about war, military force. We need to change that paradigm. Your troops are confined to barracks. You stop doing bayonet training. Hell, you stop doing any meaningful training at all. Your tanks stay in because you're not going to fight large-scale tank warfare. There's no reason to bring 54 tanks out on the Grafenberg battlefield to work on getting battalions to cooperate with battalions. You may bring out 14 tanks to work with an infantry battalion in a peacekeeping scenario that was replicated, that you saw play out in Yugoslavia. But that's it. That's not high-intensity conflict. You worry more about medical evacuation than you do about closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower maneuver. You lose your focus, you lose your edge, and that's where NATO is today. Europe, NATO was constructed with the Cold War in mind. All of the infrastructure for NATO goes back to justifications that were created during the Cold War to justify large standing armies ready on a moment's notice to respond to a Soviet incursion, to go from 0 to 60 in a blink of an eye, 24/7, every day of the year. Then the Cold War ended, and the justification for that went away. So what did they do? They stopped maintaining their armies. Their armies aren't ready to fight at a moment's notice. They took them to the garrison. There was no more training for high-intensity land warfare because that was supposed to be a thing of the past. But they maintained this infrastructure, this architecture. But instead of being cutting edge, ready to fight a war, it became a sinecure. You went to NATO for a career, and you got involved in the logistics groups, and you got involved in think tanks, and you got involved in conceptualizing a new role for NATO in the world. Today, you're doing everything but preparing to fight a war. When you have the president of Russia and the president of the United States speaking on such an important issue, that's bad news for Europe, and that's bad news for Ukraine, because the United States is going to agree to most, if not all, of Russia's conditions, because it's a game we started. We got Ukraine to agree to play the game, and we got Europe to buy into the rules of the game. I don't think that this is going to be the last negotiation, but I think this is the most important negotiation. Everything else was a setup for this. The Ukrainians have committed to a process. Europe has bought into the process. Russia agrees to the process. We have a tennis match. And now Russia is sending the ball back. But the player isn't Ukraine. Now the Russians are saying reality-based, because that's the other thing that the Trump administration kept talking about, whether it's Pete Hegseth or whether it was J.D. Vance, whether it's Marco Rubio, whether it's the president himself. We have to be dealing with the situation as it exists on the ground, the reality of it. And Russia is about to set forth. He is so far removed from reality, it's not even funny. So he's finished. It's the end of Zelensky. And when Zelensky goes, you're going to see a collapse of Ukraine, political will, social will. And all Russia has to do, keep the game playing until Ukraine gets into a position where they will comply with Russia's demands. And Europe will have no choice but to follow along. This is the game that's being played. It's called diplomacy. It's a master class being put on by the Russians, and I believe with the assistance of the United States. First of all, let's understand the following. Zelensky, the United States humiliated him in Washington, D.C., and then he was in Riyadh meeting with the crown prince, but he wasn't allowed to be the head of the delegation. And right now, inside in Kiev, you hear talk now that he's out. He's done. And my guess is that he'll be out of there within 2 weeks. I don't know where he physically is right now. I don't know if he's on the sidelines of the G7 meeting. I don't know if he returned to Kiev, but he can't last long in Kiev. He's been discredited as a leader, humiliated as a leader, and he has once again directly contradicted the United States after a meeting where his negotiating team received information from Marco Rubio about territorial concessions, that this isn't going back to 2014 or 2022. It's dealing with the reality that exists today. And the Ukrainian delegation went, yeah, we understand that. Zelensky came out and said, no, 2014. We get everything back. We get all of Novorossiya, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and we get Crimea. That's the only term. And I think that once Trump and Putin nail down the basics, they'll bring in a closer who will come in and close the deal. And that's going to happen in a matter of weeks. I think the Ukrainian government collapses. Now you have the conditions to where Russia can come in and participate in a post-conflict election that gets their man installed, gets a parliament, a Rada installed that's willing to make the constitutional changes that Russia views, who will agree to demilitarization on the terms set forth by Russia. And Europe will have no choice but to comply with this. This is what happened in Riyadh. Europe was trapped into a position where a ceasefire is now the primary policy objective, as opposed to humbling Russia, defeating Russia, all the things they were talking about. That's not being talked about now. They're talking about the necessity of a ceasefire. This is the game. We're moving towards a ceasefire, the conditions that need to be met to make a ceasefire possible. Who's not in Moscow right now from the United States? Marco Rubio. Why isn't the Secretary of State, who has been involved in these negotiations, not present for the most important negotiation? Because he's always been a figurehead. There's somebody else pulling the strings, somebody else calling the shots. And Rubio isn't needed for this. In fact, he's a distraction from this because Rubio has tainted himself with the Ukrainian brush and the European brush. So he's over there now playing with Europe. What happened to the last person who was supposed to be the one leading the efforts and they got sidelined and sent to Europe? His name was Keith Kellogg. You do know that he was fired. He's no longer the special envoy. I'm not saying that Rubio is going to be fired. I'm going to say that Rubio is not going to be a major part of the Russian negotiation going forward. This is now in Donald Trump's hands. Steve Witkoff, although they said he's not going to be the principal negotiator, Steve Witkoff is the facilitator. And he's got this in Trump's hands. NATO doesn't buy tanks. NATO doesn't buy aircraft. NATO doesn't buy artillery pieces. NATO doesn't buy artillery shells. That's the responsibility of sovereign states. And so whatever scheme the British and the French are cooking up, it's not bypassing NATO. NATO was never involved in it. This is a unilateral decision made by the two nations independent of NATO. When we speak of NATO funding, we're not talking about the defense budgets of the sovereign states. That's not NATO funding. NATO funding is the percentage of national treasury that is allocated to each nation to keep NATO functioning civilly. NATO has a number of civil programs to keep the secretariat functioning, pay the salary of NATO employees, and then certain costs that are associated with shared military spending to ensure that there's compatibility, etc. But I do want to point out that the methodology being considered by Europe to borrow from itself 800 billion euro, there is a precedent in the last 2 years of this model, and it's not a good model. The Germans in 2022 talked about spending 100 billion euro to a one-time expenditure to get the German army up out of the doldrums, become this lethal fighting force. Maybe they should have consulted with an accountant beforehand, because my understanding is that the Germans borrowed this money from themselves at a 14% interest rate. And almost immediately upon having that money allocated, they had to begin making interest rate payments. And by the end of the first year, without any weapons being procured, they were down to about between 50 and 60 billion euros that were usable. The rest was already allocated to pay back the loan, the interest rates, etc. And the longer they go with this, the more the purchasing power shrinks. And again, the expense of carrying this European-only arsenal, they're going to be paying premium prices for this. There won't be discounts. And at the end of the day, nothing's going to happen that's positive. In fact, it will make Europe weaker, just like Germany became weaker by allocating this $100 billion, because the $100 billion didn't accomplish anything. I've used this analogy before, but I'll use it again. If I have $20,000 and I want to make investments in my home's 50 years old, could use a new roof, could use get rid of that 50-year-old linoleum in the kitchen and maybe put down some nice tiles. The windows, we got 50-year-old windows, which means there's a lot of leaking and inefficiency there. We'd like to replace those. So we have this 20,000, and we want to use it to bring our home up to speed. You think my 20,000 is going to cover that? What happens when I begin to initiate the renovations necessary to take care of a fundamentally deficient home? I start tearing out the ceiling, tearing out the roof. And so I've torn down the house, and now I bring my 20 grand, and it doesn't even begin to start. It's done in a week. And all I have now is a torn up house and broken. This is what's going to happen to Europe. This is what's going to happen. It's not 800 billion euro. If you're dealing with a 14% interest rate, whatever I think that's the loan terms that they're talking about, this 800 billion is going to be reduced to 620 billion right off the bat. Drop it down to maybe a little over 500 billion by the time fall, the year's end comes around. So it ain't 800 billion. It's going to be significantly less than that.